I'm here in LA with Max Presneill in his studio, and we're talking today about Max's practice, which extends into curation, and also I suppose the business side of art as well, which is something that you're very much involved in. So Max, just to start off, for you, what was modernism, and what's the impact on your work, if any?
Okay, I don't really think it's possible to make work without having a relationship to modernism. Too many of the central approaches, the ways that we even think about what it means to be an artist are tied up with that, whether we like it or not. I think that there's aspects of how we think about what art should do and what it might be that it's not that they linger, they've never gone away. For me personally, although the angles and the facets that are on my paintings, they don't refer to Cubism, I'm a huge fan of Cubism because it changes the nature of how we think of what art does. It doesn't show us a picture, it shows us a way of thinking about something. And I think that's a crucial turning moment which has led to the developments in later modernism, and certainly impacts and influences what we see being made by anyone, anywhere, all the time. I don't think there's a way out of that. The only things that one can do if we talk about aspects of postmodernism is critique some of the fundamentals and approaches of modernism, but you're still involved with modernism.
Talking specifically of your practice, you're a painter. What is it for you that painting has as a medium?
It's visceral. I mean, it's entirely to do with like this material, the smell, colour, etc. And it has more control. I don't think photography and film-based work has quite the amount of freedom involved. But again, I mean, the tools, I'm not sure that it makes any difference. I don't see a hierarchical position with any of them. I don't think anybody that talks about the death of painting obviously doesn't know anything about painting anyway, as far as I'm concerned. And if it is dead, it's doing an awfully good vampiric act, which those kind of arguments don't make any sense to me as a curator or as an artist. I mean, it doesn't matter what you use. You could be using toothpicks. It matters what you make with them, and whether it's photography makes no difference to me. Although I must say, I think with cell phones and everything else, the inclination is for that anybody can partake. I think camera and film work are more attractive to younger people because they're more at home with them.
Do you think there's there's kind of a democratization that happens with the availability? I don't know if I've ever used that term. Right, okay. Yeah,
when it comes to art at all, in any way. I think that people feel more comfortable. They're more used to it. They've had cameras. 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds can pick up a camera up now and have a camera and take photographs. I don't know that has anything to do with anything else. I think maybe one of the problems is in a kind of liberal arts education is that one needs to learn to think beyond the ways that one knows how to think. And perhaps with photography and film-based work is they're already too familiar. It's how to break out of the tropes that they fully understand. I mean, because everybody watches movies, everybody sees photographs every day, everybody is familiar with how to take them to some degree, but certainly familiar with seeing them and understanding them to perhaps a greater degree. And I'm not sure, I don't think an art education is there to reinforce what they know, it's to show them all the stuff they perhaps don't know yet. Where that leads, who knows?
Well, I can certainly see that, what you're saying there, that approach in your own studio work, because you've showed me today a few works in your studio where, while they're in, I think you said to me, while they're in here, they're fair game for being worked on even further. So there is a part of the process, the actual creative process of making the work is part of the, almost like the research.
It's ongoing. I mean, the difference between I think how some artists approach their work, and certainly perhaps to a greater degree, say photography, where you take the image and you can manipulate, but either happy or not, and you take another one. But with paintings, for me, it's always continuously ongoing. That old question about when is a painting finished, they're not, as far as I'm concerned, until somebody takes them out of my studio, myself or somebody else. But while they're in here, they're subject to change. But I think that's a way of thinking about the interest in making paintings, not in looking at them and going to see them or whatever, but in making them is all based around the process of engaging with this visual form, talking about how representation works, etc. But that is ever-changing minute-to-minute dynamic, and the good thing about painting in the studio is that it changes continuously. So even the things I think painting might be about, I'll come in the next day and it's about something else to me. To the point where I don't really understand my old paintings. I have to think through them to get a real insight into them again. I have to build that thing back again.
The subject matter that you work on, one of the pieces which you may be able to see in the background on here, is a section from a larger painting that you did based on Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, 1818, I think. Possibly.
More about than me.
I don't know, but if I've got that wrong, I'll look like an idiot.
Change it later.
And yet other works that I've seen of yours refer to popular cultural imagery, fragments of things. So when you're drawing on the images that are then sort of articulated through your painting, what are the thought processes that you're going through?
Well, I think that part of this is thinking about art history, culture at large, as being part of the toolbox, which means that the potential for anything to be included is there. Taking on board that, there is also at some point a rethinking of how they place themselves in relationship to art history. There's the deliberate development of multiple levels of what the paintings might be addressing. As they're progressing, they are about how to paint. How does one solve problems? How does cognition work, essentially? And that happens through looking at these as sections, if you like, in a collage type way, of approaching them as very different sets of problems that need solving in very different ways. Hence the clashing colours and different stylistic approaches. It's because they require, each part requires a different solution. Depending on how deeply one wants to spend time thinking about them, of course, is I see them in relationship to how does the subjective self understand the world around them, images, representations. How does one figure memory through the visualization? How does that change? And what that memory might mean? What does it mean in relationship to fact and fiction? What does it mean to reality in some ways? Same as when you were at school, I went through a very academic theoretical course, and it's informed the way that I think about the work. They're less to do with any personal expression in that kind of loose term that one might use, and far more about an investigation, the way I see them. Although one has to, theoretically, you leave open the emotional, perhaps more personal side to become part of the dialogue. So it incorporates those kind of elements into it, but it incorporates them as an argument, not because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. I completely understand that. So art history really is, it's always there, it's always present. Like you said, it's the dialogue that, it's part of the dialogue, along with popular culture. Those things I don't see, and I don't mean this in a postmodern way of they're all evened out, because they're not. It's all about appropriateness to a situation. Things will crop up because it means something to me, and I'll use it, although it's a very personalised way of saying it, a very hermetic understanding of something. But then that feeds into the larger discussion about how one's subjectivity affects the way one reads culture. I think that use of things that, even if they're from a cultural standpoint, Peter Pan, for instance, how they're mutated through personal experiences and become this other, and then when they're reincorporated into a painting which is referring to other paintings and histories, it has both a hermetic meaning and a generalised cultural meaning that might be at odds in the reading.
Yeah. Now, in terms of you are also you're a curator at the Torrance Art Museum, and you have quite a substantial curatorial practice. How do you see, as a practicing artist and as a curator, those two different elements of your overall work as?
I don't see them as very different.
Yeah.
In several ways. I think both of them are an amalgamation of thoughts and ideas that were brought together in one place, one being the museum and the other being the painting service. I think there's a more interesting dialogue, which is that over 20 years perhaps there's been a growth of what we call the artist curator, and I do believe that those people conduct their business in a very different way than an art historian does. I think art historians, as a general rule, tend to decide on an interesting theoretical position and then use artists as illustrations to prove that position. I think the best of the artist curators do the opposite. And I think the way they do that in opposition is that they think about a core idea and they find as many different ways to think about it as possible, which I think leads to a couple of advantages in general. One is that it allows the artworks to breathe outside of the limitations of the theme. It allows more complicated and complex relationships between the works within the show. It plays to the changing complexities of how artists understand what it is that they make. Because one might say, well, we'll use the Raft and Medusa in a show to do with the lone survivor, the isolated, those left behind, blah, blah, blah. True, but that's not really what the painting was about. The painting is a political statement. And just by putting it in a certain context, you've already lost, for most of the audience, the key element of why the painting was painted. It's not about a shipwreck, it's about a political situation. And I think that the good thing, for the best of the arts curators, that they understand those complexities and they are planned into the shows. You have your theme, you look broadly and let what happens in those spaces occur. And that's where I think the most interesting readings happen for an audience, as opposed to, A, B, C, D, here's how it happened, here's the historical realm, here's works that support my thesis. That's great for historians, but it's not great for artists. And my job as a curator is not as a historian. My job as a curator is to present art in the ways that one can best read it and understand it, and to try to some degree to see the world through the eyes of the person who made an individual work, not as a stand back, somewhat isolating, singular theoretical positioning, but to try and understand it in a wider context. And I think that's very difficult to do, but I think that having the kind of reverse, blowing out from an idea as opposed to bringing in, supports that way of approaching art somewhat more.
It's almost, it makes me think of, we have these arguments in academia about, research-led practice or practice-led research. And it sounds like the approach that you're taking is a much more practice, it's treating the practice itself as the generation of knowledge, of the generation.
Do you mean the practice of curation, or the practice?
The artist's own practice.
Well, one of the things we do at the museum was when we select artists to be in a show, we don't select the works anymore. It was a decision we consciously decided to adopt.
That's really interesting.
That if we think an artist's good enough to come into the museum and appropriate in their general practice as opposed to a singular work, towards a thematic, so it can be expansive. The best way of staying away from my individual taste, and the best way to support what the artist believes is important, is to allow them to select what they're going to show, and so they can be happy with that. I've had arguments with some other museum curators that will say, yes, but we have the trained eye. It's true, but I'm not sure that that's what the museum should be there for. It's not to show you my connoisseurship. It is there to support the artist and to decide to present what we might think is interest, current, whatever it might be, but to present it in the best light according to how the artist sees what's going on, not for us to impose meanings to our satisfaction onto it, but to best adapt to what they believe they're doing. which can be a little disconcerting at times. But it is a trust issue. I think we have to invest into trusting in those people to, and back stuff, even if I don't particularly like it. Our job is a support system. In some ways, I see our job as far more perhaps like a producer in a movie than a director.
Yeah, this is how much most curators work. They have an idea. Quite often they try and very much try to fit round pegs into square holes. Absolutely. In the choices that they make. Yeah. Whilst yours, in many respects, is much more about bringing things together and seeing how they catalyse.
Well, one of the, you just said, the peg thing. This is really the crux of the matter. Is I agree. Some people are just trying to stick round pegs in square holes and vice versa. Sometimes not. But the point is we shouldn't be trying to force anything into anything. The show ideas are generally wide enough to speculate in a kind of intellectual fashion widely, and then one finds enough artists that will relate in tangents from that. Yeah. For me, it makes more interesting shows. It makes these more divergent shows. It makes for more unexpected juxtapositions between things, and certainly with the works within a show, there's this kind of cross beams of ideas which you can see starting to be picked up, which might not have been generated as the original idea at all, but if you see them reoccurring in multiple works within an exhibition, it starts you on that track of, so people are thinking about this, obviously perhaps thinking, some of them are thinking along parallel lines about these other things, which brings in a wider dialogue. Well, what's the relationship with that? These extras into the core, and I just think it builds on builds layers of complexity, which it's very easy to dismiss in the show. I saw the a show at a museum. The show shall remain nameless, and but I saw a show at another museum, and there was some works in there, and I loved the artist's work, I really do. But I thought they're not in there for any other reason than their names, because the relationship to the meaning of the show and the works in there was horribly superficial, because it didn't allow for any complexity and play with the artwork. It just used it on this very simplistic way to add into this weird mix that the show's on. It's terrible curating. And I'm not making, I don't think that artist curators are necessarily the best. I just think that they tend to think about things in the way that work is made, which is inherently complex. And so that often leads to more interesting and dynamic shows, perhaps.
That's true, because I suppose you're thinking much more about process and the thinking part of process rather than the end product. What do you think then of? What are your thoughts about these large survey shows, things like Documentary, which we were talking about earlier, or Venice Biennale, and these shows that attempt in some way to encompass a much broader international picture?
Well, I wish there was less of them, because how special they were before has been somewhat diluted, I think. And there's somewhat of a problem of it becoming a bit of a tour with the same artists and reappearing in various venues. I'd like to see more variation in how they're presented. I'd certainly like to see some risks taken with them. As a general thing, I actually enjoy them. I think they're fun, although I often find them as frustrating as enjoyable. As a kind of general thing, I'm drawn to them. The spectacle of the whole thing is, I'm a sucker for. Woohoo! Look, it's huge and there's loads, which I can't help myself about. And I do manage to most of them see some things that I'm unfamiliar with, artists I'm unfamiliar with, which is great. But there's too many, and I don't know if they have enough variation to warrant the existence of so many. I think it's cultural tourism. I don't think there's any argument about that. And that isn't necessarily what's best for seeing great art.
For me, when we went to Documentary recently, there seemed to be this sort of tension between are you meant as a curator to be making a grand statement, some sort of overarching narrative with all of these many works and artists, or are you meant to be showing a number of complex, different, maybe unrelated ideas at the one time, or to me, even after all these years, I still haven't quite decided what the intention is of those exhibitions.
Well, you know, it's funny because I a few years ago I got interested, and I still am, in at what point can we be honest as curators, and to the point of, and curators will talk about this, but they won't do the show very often, which is art that I like.
Yeah.
You know, it's nothing else about it. But that, I mean, if you did those shows, and we actually try and do them at TAM now, we do shows which every year we do a thing called Baker's Dozen, which is, there's no connection. This is just art we think you should be looking at.
Yeah.
Because at certain, I do think that there's I'm an ex-academic, right? I'm theoretical background and everything else. But at certain times, it's just boring. You know, I go to see shows myself, and if I'm really honest about it, most of the time I go just look at things, and sometimes I think that's what we should be doing. Sometimes as shows, we have to do some historically important shows, we have to do some theoretically researched, tight shows too, but there should be a gap in there for shit that I like, and be completely honest about it. There should also, I think, be we try and do this now at the museum, is incorporate things that we know are going to fail. Like we did this show with a group called Onansi. They're young, 3 guys. They all live in different cities, New York, Boston, and one just moved out here. And they invite other artists to come in and collaborate and whatever. They don't know what's going to turn up. They don't know what it's going to end up like. But I really like the idea that we take these chances on, this is how production, this is manifestations of recent directions in production, group collaboratives, this kind of thing, wider collaboratives that bring people in. These things are what is the most important thing going on at the moment, I think. And I think that these, we as institutions, small institutions like ours, we can afford to take those risks and do those shows. We're not MoCA, we're not LACMA. Wish we had the money they do and the space they do, but we can move faster, and we don't have to constantly have these blockbuster shows regardless of actually how good they are. We can take those chances that they don't or won't, and I think it's really interesting for people in my position with control of these smaller museums, is to be able to really expand out notions of what the museum should be doing, different methodologies, different approaches to making work. I find relational aesthetics often very difficult and very boring. I think there's too much bad sociology coupled with really crappy art under that banner.
It's like ethno methodology, isn't it?
It's really poor sometimes. But when it's at its best, and how one finds that and works with it, then I'm interested. And I think that our role in those kind of small institutions should be entirely kind of focused towards these new dynamics and really looking at what artists are doing. At the same time, we have an audience of other people that come along, so we do, we'll do a show of painting show, new painters every year. So it's a kind of balance between all these kind of very, very different areas that I think that certainly, for me at least, is the most exciting kind of areas to be working in right now. It doesn't pay as much, and it doesn't have the glamour, but it means we work with artists that we don't already know too much about. And no offense to the dead Andy Warhol, I don't care if I ever see another Warhol the rest of my life. I really don't give a shit. But there's loads of artists out there that I see like every week that I've never seen before, never heard of, and some of that stuff is really exciting. I mean, some of that's really gets my excitement levels up. Yes, more to see.
The word museum has a kind of a...
That's what does it.
Has baggage, doesn't it? Which almost works against that. Just the word in itself almost works against the particular kind of attitude and approach that you've got. What do you think about?
Well, I think we actually approach it far more like a Kunsthalle than a museum as such. Although the difference is that there's a whole area to argue about what that might mean. I think that the problem comes with dealing with government and all sorts of other areas, because museum implies educational. What constitutes education is a different ball game. That's where it starts getting difficult. I think, to what degree are you supposed to explain something or just present? What are the points that one is expected to adapt didactics to, for instance? I mean, those kind of things are what become problematic through the idea of museum. but I do think people have got a really, too often in the art world, have got a really old-fashioned idea about what a museum means. Well, if you want to go far enough back, it's a private collection by somebody with more money than God. Right? That's what it actually starts out with. But most people will say, no, we're not talking about that. Well, you're not actually talking about anything, because there's loads of models, and which one do you care to kind of follow? And they have different agendas. They have different ways of approaching things, and so they should. That's why you can. It's interesting to go more than one. I'm not really sure what museum means anymore, and I'm not sure it's relevant anymore. I mean, we do things that we think reflect on current practices. We reflect on things that we think are exciting. We do some stuff that is a little bit more historical. We even do a local group show of local artists within a quite wide geographical area once a year. I mean, it really is, the museum plays multiple parts, and for me, it should be a place of experimentation in itself as a practice. And so that's what we do. We try and kind of figure ways that we might do something a little bit different. But our main credo, I guess, is to do it understanding that we're there as the intermediary between an audience and the artist, and our job in terms of putting the shows together is to support the artist and then explain why to people that come to the openings. There's various parts. We don't employ anyone who isn't a practicing artist now as policy, because that's easier for us to get them to understand exactly what we're looking for here, what we're trying to aim at, and how we want them to function with the artists that will be showing with us, and their relationship, building out its peer relationships. Yeah, it makes a difference. It makes it easier to when working with artists, to make them understand, yes, we have a small budget, so there's going to be limitations, that there are things that we have to be aware of. But if we're talking peer-to-peer, it makes it far more of a collaborative feel of, let's do this together and support and go the extra yard and all this kind of thing, which changes the dynamic considerably. This year, Baker's Dozen, for instance, it's always 13 artists, but this year we asked myself and 12 other curators from other institutions to choose one artist each for the show. Yeah. And I think it'll tell us about some really interesting artists that are emerging now. But as importantly, it'll tell us as much about institutions, people that run them, what decisions they're making, why. Yeah. And so it serves like multiple purposes in the show. Is it are the different curators from a gamut of different types of institutions? Yeah. Some of the larger museums, all the way down to a fine arts centre. Yeah. So it's across the board. Yeah. And the aesthetic is very rangy, shall we say? Yeah. You were saying earlier before this interview about how the area that you live in here, which is on the east side of Los Angeles, has become a bit of a hub now in recent years, largely, I suppose, as a result of the GFC. What do you think has come out of, for you locally, the GFC, for this different new context locally in Los Angeles? I think the most important thing that I think is going on here is probably the rise of the number of artist-run spaces, and what they're looking at and how they're dealing with whatever aspect of art that they're dealing with. They are truly across the board, and there are lots of them. So there's actually been an increase with... Oh God, they're all over the place. Really? Wow. I'm guessing that there's probably 40 ones that I'm aware of, and 40 is a lot in a city. Yeah. Considering we have quite a large commercial gallery system, and that normally, I don't know, squashes a little bit the sort of alternative art scene somewhat. They're very dynamic, and I'm excited by those far more than I am the commercial galleries in general. I think there's more interesting things going on there, and it's the same thing. Whatever anybody taught you at school, do the opposite. They come out of these grad schools. They're mostly from grad school that they come in these little units, and they set up a space somewhere. And some of it takes broadening one's horizons constantly, because they're not doing things the way we do as older people. But that's the rub. That's why it's exciting. Yeah. Precisely because they're not. I think that's the most. This is one, like this east side of LA, why it's really interesting, because within 5 miles of hit from this very point, I would guess we could go to 25 alternative spaces.
That's amazing.
That's a fair amount. I mean, and some of them are really good.
Is it because often, for instance, in Sydney, there was a lot of artist-run space in the 90s that as the real estate values went up, a lot of these spaces, such as there was one called Airspace, I remember showing in about 20 years ago when I was an art student. That's now flat because the inner city land becomes really valuable, so it gets sold off to developers and just becomes apartment blocks. But here it sounds like the lull in the real estate market, or rather what's happened with the economy is actually caused this lull in the real estate market, which has allowed that to happen. It's actually been a really fruitful.
Yeah, there's LA is a city that actually has a fair bit of space, and it always has done. So there's always been groups working out of like corner stores or like empty factories and that kind of thing. It's just more so now with the economy. But it's also like there's far more nomadic groups, for instance, and they'll take advantage of whatever space wherever. There were examples of that when I was young, like a younger artist, but far more of them now. It's completely accepted if somebody just says, "I have a nomadics group." Okay, I mean, it's not even a difficult question anymore. And they can be really, really active, which is the core of it. I mean, it's all right saying you're nomadic, but if you do one show a year, you're not nomadic. You're just lazy. So it's nice to see that some people. There are groups that are nearly as active as people with spaces often.
Yeah.
They can do 5-6 shows a year. That's a lot of shows to do for someone that's not doing this as a pro, as it were. And
are they taking the exhibition sort of out of the... Oh, another glove question. Where are they taking the exhibition?
I think that you could have kept on with the original question. It would have ended up in the same place. Everywhere and anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be anything from descriptions of places that you can't see because you're not there to, like a normal exhibition space that they've taken over, houses, telephone booths, underneath stairs, online only. It exists as an exhibition through Twitter. Whatever it might be. I mean, if somebody's, it's like kinky sex. If you can think of it, somebody's done it.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of open to that. There isn't a limit on where people will find to show art.
Yeah.
And then those younger groups are normally the ones that are far more adventurous now, where they've got less to lose, and they don't have as many options. So it forces them into being a bit more experimental.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's always good.
Yes, no, that's true.
Just means it's experimental.
But it does mean there's kind of fertile ground, and I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about as well was we've kind of moved from you as a practicing artist to your curatorial work, and one of the things that you've had to learn really here in LA is the business side as well of art. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Well, first I had to learn to speak American.
Yeah.
And it is a different language. Well, I mean, it's a too wide a question, essentially, because it really does need narrowing down to what part of the business are you talking about.
Yes.
There is the commercial gallery world. There is the how to deal with museums. It's a different question. And I guess the big question is normally, how do I get my work seen by galleries?
Yes, that's a very good question,
Just
particularly for art students.
That's exactly what everybody wants to know. And I think that the things to remember for anybody that's interested in this is gallerists hate pressure. So everything has to be a little bit subtler and a roundabout, getting them to see it. I think that they need to understand that there are some sharks out there, as there are sharks as artists, and that their fundamental motivation is not the money. Their fundamental motivation for most gallerists is making the deal and working within the structures of this three-dimensional chess game that they like playing. Often they have alternative sources of income. And some of that makes more money than they're ever going to make in their galleries. So realistically, the fact is a lot of them do it because they love the game. They like being the gallerist, they like the hierarchical position that gives them, and it allows them to go around the world and be recognised and have power over people and everything else. I think if you recognise that, then it will change the way the dynamic works when you're talking to them and working with them. It isn't about the money, don't mistake it. Understand it's about how can you help them make the deal. Therefore, the more support you get from them. I think that the one needs to be really, really realistic about pricing, that kind of a thing. As an example, emerging artist has 10 works. They're going to be priced at 10,000, and they're going to go into a gallery, a reasonably good gallery. So if you have 10 works and you sold everything, which is never going to happen, but say it did, 10,000 work, 10 works at 10,000, that's $100,000, of which the artist gets 50,000. And you think, yay, now that the gallery owes me. Well, no, because it costs them more money than that to do the show, with the advertising, the space, the staff, everything else. It's more money to do the show than that brings. That's if you sold out everything. So essentially, if they are supporting you, they're going to be supporting you, losing money for them for how many years? I mean, average one has a show, what, every 2 years? Okay, so hopefully the second show is going to be a little bit more successful. But it's not until third, fourth, fifth show that you're actually making them any money that's significant into the program. And I think that if artists understood that, they would understand how much support they're actually getting financially from the gallery, which makes it easier to deal with them. I mean, you think that they're greedy. Artists often think that gallerists do this greedy thing without realising how much they're investing into you. And it also makes it easier to do business if you understand the structure. People are going to be as their sales go up, their reputation goes up. They're the people whose sales are supporting the emerging artists, that kind of thing. So when people go and skip the gallery because they see greener pastures, they should think long and hard before doing that, because it's not only the gallery that they're kind of screwing over after investing all that money into them, it's also the emerging artists that are on the program. And those galleries won't get big without good artists sticking with them. And if they're supportive, if they allow you to make the changes you want to make in your work without being arseholes about it, if they are giving you shows regardless of whether you're selling, all these things, loyalty would demand that you reciprocate. Because if they are like that and they've had the sense to see something in your artwork and you become successful, then presumably they have a good eye with other people, in which case that program might well be a big deal gallery, and they should support that through. If it's talking about somebody going immediately to a good gallery, then they need, as a young artist, they need to be really, really careful, because if it doesn't go right and that gallery dumps them, where do you go? What's left? It's very difficult to get taken up by smaller galleries. And it's a blow to the ego to be in a smaller gallery. I think there's lots of pitfalls in that whole scenario, the whole world of the commercial galleries, that there isn't any way around doing the hard work to find out. One of the things I get asked all the time, which galleries do you think I should approach? And I'm not going to do that research for you. My response is, do the research. And it's a slow process and it's tiresome, but there isn't a better substitute for going through every gallery's program, seeing, okay, it's kind of similar, there's things that they obviously like that I like, but there isn't somebody there that looks like me, because then why take you? They've already got somebody. But those kind of critical judgments about the spaces you want to show, a realism about it, like, oh, I want to show Werner, I want to show Gagosian. Well, good, I'm sure you want to be a multi-billionaire too, but that's not happening right now. So I think realism has to be in there, and self-criticality. They have to be self-critical about the work, as they should be as artists anyway. And
I think you need to accept criticism, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody's giving them criticism that actually does know what they're talking about, etc., listen, because they know more than you do. Oh, it's real simple. But a self-criticality about how the work functions in the wider exhibiting world. Where does it fit? Why does it fit? What are the galleries that realistically you should be looking at? Because this happens to me all the time. Some people come from other countries and say, oh, here's my list of the top 5 that I want to show with. Gagosian, Regan projects, Blum and Poe. It's like, then, I'm sorry, do you not realise how they work? Do you not realise they have these huge programs because they go and take them from other big galleries? They don't don't pick you up off the street and say, hey, you look like a star. This isn't this isn't movie land. Or at least the cliches about movie land. It doesn't work that way. And all those kind of ways of realizing, this is true of any business. This isn't art-wise. This is true of everything. You need to know how the game's played to play.
Yeah.
You go on a football field and start like running up and trying to climb the goalpost. That's not how the game's played. You're not going to do very well. You have to learn how to kick the ball, all that kind of stuff.
So how would an artist, an emerging artist who would be exhibiting in an artist-run space, they've maybe been to art school and graduated a year or two ago, how would they actually go about approaching?
Well, I think the first thing is recognise the power of the alternative spaces, because everyone that's networking in that are your future support system, and that people that are going to be famous are in that pool at any given moment. So that's your chance to build a culture of support with your peers, and that leads to things in the future, because essentially everything leads from somebody recommending somebody else. How does one approach good galleries when mostly they don't accept submissions? It's normally then through somebody that's already in the gallery or connected to the gallery. So if you don't know those people, the only real route to do it, I think, is get enough of a resume builder that you'll become part of their radar ping, and so they become aware of you. Certainly one of the things I think that as an ex-commercial gallerist that works, if somebody comes into the gallery regularly, sees the shows, has an intelligent talk about what the show is, it grows your respect for them, and at that point you kind of, if they said to me, would you mind looking at my work? Yeah, you're an intelligent person, you've supported this gallery by coming here. Yeah, I'll look. But that's a long-term kind of thing. You have to keep going to see the shows. You have to establish a rapport with the people who work there, and that goes both ways. It's also, do you want to see what they're like? If they treat you like a scumbag, you probably want to stay away from them. And even if they're a good gallery, you probably want to stay away from them. And I think that it's a long, slow investment. And you keep going to shows, and you do it to multiple galleries. You go to multiple shows regularly. You talk to those people about the shows, make some intelligent comments, and at some point, a lot of them will just say, "What do you do?" And if they ask you, the pressure's off. Oh, I'll send you a disc. Send them a disc. If they like it, they'll get back. It's not for everyone, and it's not personal. They're not saying your dick's too small by rejecting you. It isn't personal. It either fits or it doesn't for them. It has no comment on the quality of the work, so nobody needs to be upset. It is a professional decision based around what they think the gallery should do or can do. And I think one needs to keep that, at least harden one's skin, so that you're not being super sensitive about the profession. I mean, there's 1,000 artists out there that they've got choice of. If they choose you, it's because you're the one in 1,000 that they're actually looking for or fits their program, and it has no bearing on how good you are. There's no relationship to anything except if they accept you because you fit you have a round peg for a round hole.
Yeah, I can see that often the context of the gallery, who is in the stable already. Like you said, often the context of the gallery is what you should be, pitching at, or is what they're responding to as well. Yeah.
You have to look at that program really objectively, and kind of see where do you supply a balance in that program? What do you contribute to an overall program? If they only show black and white work, and I'm sending this, that's not going to work. If everything in there's minimalist sculpture, this isn't going to work. Make it obvious. One needs to develop a somewhat more nuanced eye when you're going through those. But there isn't any way not to do research. Although, for those that are the most ambitious amongst your students, the easiest way to decide on the galleries to start looking at is to see who's doing what art fairs. You go to the art fair websites, you see who's on those lists that are doing them, and then you go to each one and you look at what they're doing, and you check out, if they have 20 artists, you look at 20 artists' work, and you see minimum 3 works by each artist, so you get a flavour for that gallery space, and that will tell you whether that might be somewhere to approach. And you can judge it if you're a new artist by looking at the smaller fairs, because they're newer galleries normally, and you can say, well, they're the ones that are probably most open to looking, because they're newer, and go down that, like, okay, Aqua in Miami, okay, look at the Aqua galleries and say, well, who might I approach from there? You don't go to Miami bars and say, who do I approach? You go to those smaller fairs, find the ones that might fit. Lister in Switzerland. Go and see who's showing at Lister. Check the fairs, know which fairs are doing what, know which fairs have what kind of programs they're attracting galleries at, and hit those up for information. Find out who's doing what, and then start sending stuff if you can. If you can't get a personal recommendation, or if you don't know an artist, look to your faculty, because they're normally better, more experienced and connected. Maybe they know somebody. A lot of the people that get into galleries in reality are there because faculty who have relationships with them suggest it.
Yeah. So building connections really is really important.
Networking.
Yeah.
But in a nice way. I mean, I think that if you're a cutthroat, ambitious networker, you just put people off.
Yeah.
It's really off-putting. I had a conversation recently about one of the difficulties of working with New York artists over LA artists, and one of those things that came up was there's a raw hunger, desperation about so many New York artists, which is so off-putting when one wants to have this is any relationship in showing, particularly for a commercial gallery, is a long-term one, and it's really off-putting if you're going to have to deal with this like high neurotic desperation, kind of focus when one got this cool person over here who's really relaxed and just wants to chuck. And if it comes down to both of them make good art, I know who I'm going to choose. It's really simple.
It's a bit like the signals market, how people can always smell desperation.
Yeah, absolutely. One has to be really, really careful. Please choose me. And that thing we were talking about earlier about looking over somebody's shoulder when you're talking to somebody, that's one of those signs. It's this desperation for, who's more important to now connect with? Well, if you're that desperate that you can't address another human being, particularly as you don't know who's who, and there's no way of telling it through what they're wearing in the art world. You never know. And if you can, a lot of those connections, some of the best connections will come from some raggedy, like fella who you don't know whatever, he's unshaven, whatever. And they might have that pull. They might be connected, and you never know. And you should just be polite to people anyway. It's all good PR, if nothing else. Constantly. I mean, there isn't better PR anywhere than artists saying good things about you or your space. So treat everyone really nicely and think. There's Robertson Tilton is a gallery here in LA, quite big. And Bennett Roberts is the director, owner, and he replies to everyone, and he's polite to everyone, and that gives him kudos amongst the artists. Everyone loves him, and there's respect that goes along with that. Even if he doesn't show you, you never have a bad word to say about him because he responded. He wrote a letter back saying, "Thanks for sending me your stuff." That kind of thing. That PR is worth more than he can pay for in any magazine.
That sort of personal element, I think, to any kind of interaction that you have with an organisation or people, I think, is really important, and it does build reputation. I think
it does. It helps because the art world isn't that big. And reputations can be sullied or made very quickly internationally within a very small bunch of people. Particularly, I don't think there isn't that game 6 degrees of separation or whatever. Art world's maybe 2. I mean, there isn't an artist on this planet you're probably more than 2 phone calls away from.
It's funny, we were talking in the car on the way here, and very quickly, I think within the space of about 5 minutes, we realised how many people we know. We live at other sides of the Pacific Ocean, but so that's very true.
And even if you don't, you always know somebody that does. I mean, that's what I'm saying about 2. Well, if you don't know, you know him, and he can tell you. So it's very small that way. So I think we have to be really. You don't have to be careful with your reputation, because being too careful about it is irritating in itself. But certainly having an awareness that that's how things are going to work when you're talking to people and giving time to people makes a difference.
How important do you think, also, this is an obvious question I suppose, but how important is what you do at art school?
Wow. One of the big questions come up in the last year or two is the value of art school at all, because of the amount of money it costs to go, etc., etc.
Yeah.
I actually still am a believer in in this religion. I think that the concentration of it and being around the peers, of keeping this dialogue up, is really super important.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. It's like growing older, right? Somebody tells you, your testicles are going to drop, but you don't believe that or even know what that means until it happens, and you're like, thank you for the warning. You can tell students about, okay, when you leave, there's not the support system, there isn't the studio, there's no reason for you to go in, you have to be motivated, and that's why 90% of you will no longer be making art in 5 years.
Yeah.
Each one of them thinks they are the one that will be. They all think that they're going to be the one that finds the gallery, etc., regardless. One has to instill good practices.
Yeah.
They have to understand the dedication it takes. During that period is the best place to learn. The things I think are really important that and a lot of faculty don't like this being said.
Yeah.
I think that most of them should be going out and showing all the time, as soon as they can, continuously.
Yeah.
A lot of faculty, no, stay away from all that bullshit.
Yeah, I agree.
You waste your time, then you're already 3 years behind somebody else that's been doing it. You need to be out there constantly. Now, what they do, all artists may take their work over time anyway, so I do think that here's something that happens to me as a museum curator a lot. I go on studio visits and I see some artwork and I think it's pretty good, but it's not where it needs to be because it hasn't got bite, say. There's something, it's a little too nice, whatever. And they'll say, yeah, but I've got gallery interest. Well, yeah, because they know they can sell it. That doesn't mean this is as good as it gets. And the galleries that are going to be attracted to this unfinished work are ones that are never going to be big galleries. And if you believe that staying where you are with this work because you want into that gallery because you don't understand that there's small fry in the world, that means you're never going to progress. You will never get any better. And it's the people that get better that get the better galleries. Yeah. And it really, I know people don't seem to understand this. They think that it's who you know and everything completely. Generally, as a general rule, it really is talent. Talent gets ahead.
Yeah.
In one way or another, it comes out. That's not to say that some things are crap still manage to get up, because they do. But the understanding for any young artist that they need to, they need to understand this, keep practice, keep showing, get themselves out there, and listen to those people with more experience that might say, wait. Because jumping into the first gallery that comes to you can do more harm than good. Not what you do at college, but what you do in the exhibitions can. Because if somebody looks at it and says, that's just terrible, then you're going to spend the next 3 years recovering from that. So the work needs to be ready. You probably need an outside independent voice to tell you when that's ready, because every artist on the planet thinks the next work's going to be better. And I'll show when I'm ready means you will never show. Because you're never ready, because I've just done that, but this next one is so exciting and it's going to be so much better. That's the nature of the game. That's why everyone keeps making. So you can't wait for when you're ready, because you're never technically ready. But I do think that taking some good advice, learn who to get advice from. Essentially, that people give bad advice, me included. But if you've got somebody that's going to be independent, and regardless of how much they like you or how well they know you, that's going to give you honest advice, because a lot of people will slap you on the back and tell you it's wonderful, and that means nothing. You need someone that's going to be critical, going to show you where the weaknesses are, because half of the skill of being good at this is learning how to edit. It's learning how to take out the weak points, because you might make great work, but it's the parts that let it down. If you know how to look for that and remove it, you're one up.
Which is where self-criticality is
absolutely
vitally important.
Really, really super important. More important probably than anything else. In some degrees, more important than talent, because at least that way you can narrow it down to the areas that you can be super strong on. Focus on the things that you can really get better and better at. So perhaps it's more important than talent.
Finally, one last question. How important? Okay, you're from London originally, and you've been in LA for now 15 years. When you cut your teeth in a particular kind of place, how important do you think it is to get out?
Really important. I think it's super important. for multiple reasons. One is that it gives you different perspectives by showing abroad. It gives you wider collector bases, which encourage more galleries to be interested. It gives you relationships with other artists in other countries, which lead to more opportunities. It enables travel, which is in itself would be a worthwhile aim. I really don't see a disadvantage to thinking internationally. There's artists that I've come across throughout my travels who have huge reputations, but literally within a small town. Well, that's great, but that means nothing. It's easy to be a big fish in a small pond. If you're happy there and stable there, you'll probably stagnate there, and that's fine if that's what you wish your life to be and your career to be. But if you have ambitions for the work, you want it to be seen by as many people as possible, and you want it to be seen by bigger, better venues. And the only way to do that is to think internationally. Anyway, I don't care where you are. New York, which tends to be a little bit myopic, and London, which can be very myopic. Even there, then you need to think internationally, and it's not that big a world.
Yeah.
You need to look at what are my opportunities in Los Angeles, New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, maybe Istanbul, Sydney. Where else do you start looking? Beijing now, Shanghai perhaps. Seoul maybe. You look at those cities and how can I establish presence there? How can I be involved? How can I get my work out to the most people? Which is presumably why somebody makes it. I don't think there's many disadvantages, even to the point where I would seriously suggest that one takes the hit, as it were, financially if need be, or in time, effort and whatever, to the point where I've done this before myself in earlier years, is make work which I would send one way and let whoever showed it keep it. It was more important to have the show and the connections than the work. I mean, it's just canvas and paint.
Yeah.
I can do another one.
Yeah.
And don't get too precious about what it is you do. They're experiments. When they're done, move on to the next experiment. But keeping that thought in mind is helpful, because you can make those establish those connections and relationships with people, because you recognise that the work is just what it is, and send it off. I actually showed one guy once who was extremely talented, and gave him his first big show, and he thought he was going to be the next Picasso, and he put his price for a drawing at 15,000. First ever show, never shown again.
Yeah.
If you think your work is that important and that world changing and that valuable, you need another line of work, and it should probably be in modelling or something. It certainly shouldn't be in the art world. You need to be really hypercritical about where you stand and this isn't worth anything except what somebody's worth. Willing to pay.
Yeah.
And the true importance of it lies in the making of it. So if one recognises that, roll the damn thing off of its thing, stick it in a tube, send it to Sydney or vice versa, get the show. Don't worry too much about whether it comes back or not. And somebody says, well, at some point it might be worth money. Yeah, but you've got to make dozens more. You've gone through more of these than you're ever going to keep. Even if you're highly successful, and even the most successful artists don't sell everything. They often throw things away. And I think it's worthwhile keeping that in mind. Because the advantages that might come from sending it and leaving it, giving it to the gallerist. Give it to an artist that you like there. Ask for an exchange. Swap.
One of the things that we were saying earlier, because you have quite a substantial collection of works from other artists as well, is the importance of swapping.
I think it's great. I mean, you establish peer relationships. You end up with a great collection, which is lovely to live around. And who knows, some of it might be worthwhile at some point, worth some money, which isn't a bad thing. And it gives it's just it's a fulfilling thing. I mean, it just gives an enhanced living experience. I mean, I love being surrounded by other people's art. Yeah. It's the same reason why collectors collect art. And normally, I know people can be cynical about thinking it's all about money, but to be honest, I mean, a lot of people that collect have more money than sense, and they don't need to be spending on art. It's partly social.
And a lot of them give it away eventually as well.
Yeah, give it to museums. I think that people enjoy being around it, and why not swap works? Worst thing is to start getting, well, my work sell for 4,000 and theirs only sells for 2. Well, that thing about be nice to people on your way up, because who knows what's going to happen on your way down. I think that's probably sage advice. Swap because it's good art. If you want it, it doesn't matter how much it's worth.
Thank Thank you very much, Max. That was an absolutely fantastic interview, and it was great to hear about your practice and also your advice for students.
You're very kind. You'll edit that out later.
Thanks a lot.